The cold metal walls of the prison cell shimmered under the dim lights, reflecting the alien queen's frustrated face. She was trapped, helpless, and far from her powerful empire. Her enemies had planned this well, too well. The queen had been on a diplomatic mission to a distant planet when a sudden attack had separated her from her royal guards. Before she could react, the enemy soldiers overwhelmed her and dragged her into this high-tech prison. It was a perfect trap. The alien queen, known across the galaxy for her strength and wisdom, was now a prisoner. She had always been the symbol of power, feared by many and respected by all. But here, locked inside this high-security cell, she felt powerless for the first time in her life. She stared at the force field that covered the entrance to her cell. It buzzed with energy, and she knew it was impossible to escape without the right technology. The walls were solid, the guards were heavily armed, and the security was top tier. Meanwhile, on the far side of the planet, Jack, the human researcher, was completely unaware of the trouble the queen was in. Jack had been living on this wild, untamed planet for months. He was part of a small human research team studying the planet's unique flora and fauna. Life was simple for him. He spent his days hiking through thick jungles, studying strange plants, and avoiding the deadly predators that roamed the wilderness. He had no fancy technology, no advanced weapons, just his brain and his survival skills. Jack had always enjoyed the quiet solitude of his life here. The planet was beautiful but dangerous, and it demanded respect from those who lived on it. Jack respected it. His simple tools and natural instincts had kept him alive, and he had learned to adapt to the harsh environment. But he had no idea that his life was about to take a wild turn. On a routine exploration trip, Jack stumbled upon something strange. As he walked through the jungle, collecting samples, he noticed something unusual in the distance. A huge structure stood out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by armed alien guards. It wasn't a natural formation. This was something built by an advanced civilization. Jack crouched behind some thick bushes, watching the scene carefully. His heart raced as he realized what he was looking at. This was no ordinary building. It was a fortress, and it looked heavily guarded. Jack had seen alien technology before, but nothing like this. The guards patrolling the perimeter were well armed, carrying weapons that looked far beyond anything he had ever seen. He could also see a strange energy field covering what seemed to be an entrance. "What is this place?" Jack whispered to himself. His curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he crept closer, staying low and moving silently. He knew the jungle well enough to avoid making noise, using the cover of thick trees and rocks to remain hidden. When he was close enough, he saw something that made his jaw drop. Inside the structure, through the energy field, he saw her. It was the alien queen. Jack had heard stories about her. Everyone in the galaxy had. She was one of the most powerful rulers, leading her people with a mix of strength and intelligence. But here she was, locked in a cage, surrounded by enemies. Jack could see the frustration on her face as she paced around the cell, clearly trying to find a way out. But there was none. The guards outside seemed relaxed, confident that no one would dare to attack them here. And with good reason. The fortress was built like a fortress, designed to be impenetrable. Jack's mind raced. He was just a human, a researcher with basic survival tools. What could he possibly do? The queen was held by a force far more advanced than anything he had ever encountered. But Jack had one thing going for him. He knew this planet. The aliens may have built their fancy fortress, but Jack knew the land better than anyone. He knew the hidden paths, the dangerous predators, and the ways to use nature itself as a weapon. For a moment, Jack considered walking away. This was way beyond him. He wasn't a soldier, and he certainly wasn't a hero. But as he looked at the queen, trapped and alone, something inside him shifted. He couldn't just leave her there. No matter how impossible it seemed, he had to try. I may be just a human, Jack thought, but I've got one advantage. They don't know me, and they don't know this planet. With that, Jack's decision was made. He backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the fortress, already forming a plan in his head. It would take every ounce of his cunning, survival skills, and a bit of luck to pull this off. But if anyone could do it, it was him. A simple human steps in. Jack crouched behind a thick bush, his eyes scanning the fortress where the alien queen was imprisoned. The alien guards patrolled the area confidently, their advanced weapons gleaming under the faint sunlight. Jack knew he was outmatched in terms of technology. These aliens were well-armed, highly trained, and far more advanced than any human. But Jack had something they didn't. He knew this wild planet better than anyone else. Jack was no soldier, but he had survived the dangers of this untamed world for months. While the alien soldiers relied on their high-tech weapons, Jack had learned to survive with nothing more than his wits and a few basic tools. The dense jungle was his ally, and nature itself had become his weapon. The aliens might have thought themselves untouchable in their high-tech fortress, but they didn't understand the dangers that lurked just beyond their walls. As Jack watched the guards, his mind raced with possibilities. He had no weapons that could take them on directly, but he didn't need to fight them head-on. If he could create a distraction, something big enough to cause chaos, he might have a chance to sneak in and reach the queen. Jack remembered the strange, aggressive creatures that roamed the jungle, the ones he had learned to avoid. These creatures were unpredictable and deadly, but Jack knew how to trigger them without putting himself in danger. He pulled out a small vial from his backpack. Inside was a potent pheromone he had extracted from one of the jungle creatures. Just a few drops of this would drive the nearby predators into a frenzy. Jack carefully uncorked the vial and poured a tiny amount on a nearby tree. Within minutes, the jungle seemed to come alive. The sound of snapping branches and growling beasts echoed through the trees. The alien guards looked around in confusion, their weapons raised, as the ground began to tremble. From the shadows, a pack of large, clawed beasts emerged. Their glowing eyes locked onto the fortress, drawn by the pheromone Jack had placed. The guards shouted in their alien language, scrambling to form a defensive line as the beasts charged. The ground shook beneath their heavy paws as they attacked the perimeter, crashing into the force field with ferocious strength. This was Jack's chance. With the guards distracted by the creatures, Jack slipped out of his hiding spot and darted toward the fortress. He moved swiftly, using the chaos to his advantage. The energy field that blocked the entrance flickered as the beasts slammed into it, causing temporary gaps. Jack timed his movements carefully, waiting for just the right moment to slip through one of the flickering sections of the force field. He dashed inside, heart pounding, knowing he had only moments before the guards regained control of the situation. Inside, the fortress was dimly lit, with smooth metal walls and narrow corridors. Jack pressed himself against the cold surface, staying out of sight as alien soldiers rushed past him, responding to the attack outside. He followed the route he had mapped out in his mind, using his memory of the fortress layout to find the queen's cell. It wasn't long before he reached the heavily guarded door, pulsing with energy. 2 alien guards stood in front of it, their backs turned as they communicated with their superiors through their comm devices. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't fight these guards directly, but he didn't have to. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out a small smoke grenade, one of the few pieces of tech he had managed to salvage from the wreckage of his own ship. With a quick flick of his wrist, he tossed the grenade toward the guards. It exploded in a cloud of thick, white smoke, engulfing the area and sending the aliens into a coughing fit. Before they could react, Jack moved swiftly. He darted past them, slipping into the small maintenance hatch beside the main door that he had noticed earlier. This hatch wasn't part of the main security system. It was a simple maintenance access point that allowed technicians to repair the force field generator from inside. Jack crawled through the narrow space, his body tense as he moved toward the inner part of the cell. The alien queen was just on the other side. Jack could hear her pacing inside, her movements sharp and impatient. Finally, after what felt like hours of crawling through the cramped tunnel, Jack reached the inner control panel. With careful hands, he tinkered with the wires, using his basic knowledge of tech to bypass the system. He heard a soft buzz as the energy field flickered and then shut down. He stepped into the cell, and there she was, the alien queen. She stood tall and regal, her glowing eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the human before her. For a moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her gaze. He was just a simple human, and she was the ruler of a powerful empire. But right now, in this moment, they were equals, two beings fighting to survive. "I'm here to help," Jack said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The queen looked at him, surprised by his courage. She had never expected a human to come for her, let alone one with no advanced technology or weapons. But as she studied Jack's determined face, she realized that this human might be the key to her escape. For the first time since her capture, hope flickered in the queen's eyes. The queen's surprise. The alien queen stood in stunned silence as she looked at the human who had just stepped into her prison cell. Jack, the simple human researcher, had managed to get past her heavily armed guards and advanced security systems. It was something no one else could have done. Not with advanced weapons, not with fleets of soldiers, but with nothing more than his wit and knowledge of the planet. The queen had always thought of humans as primitive creatures, far beneath her empire's great power. But this human had surprised her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jack could feel the tension in the air. The alien queen, tall and imposing, with her sharp, glowing eyes, was clearly sizing him up. He wondered what she was thinking. Was she about to attack him? Was she angry that someone like him had come to her rescue? He had no idea what to expect. Finally, the queen broke the silence. "You are human." Her voice was deep, resonating with authority. She spoke his language perfectly, though her tone held a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Jack nodded, feeling a little nervous under her intense gaze. "Yes, I'm here to get you out of here." The queen's expression remained unreadable. She didn't seem convinced. "A human. You are just one man. Do you really think you can defeat the forces that hold me captive?" Jack scratched the back of his head, feeling a bit awkward. He wasn't sure how to answer. He knew he wasn't a warrior or a hero, but he had made it this far. "I may not have advanced weapons or an army," he said, "but I know this planet better than they do. I can help you escape." The queen's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were considering his words carefully. She had never met a human who spoke with such confidence, especially not one who had managed to sneak into a fortress as heavily guarded as this one. She had expected some grand rescue plan from her royal fleet, but instead, this human, armed with nothing but basic tools and jungle knowledge, was standing before her, offering help. "You are different," the queen finally said, her voice softening just a little. "I did not expect anyone from your kind to take such risks for me." Jack shrugged, a small smile appearing on his face. "Well, I guess we humans are full of surprises." The queen's face remained serious, but there was a flicker of amusement in her glowing eyes. She wasn't used to this kind of lightheartedness, especially not from someone in such a dangerous situation. She was used to soldiers, to warriors, to people who spoke with formality and fear in her presence. But this human was different. He wasn't afraid of her. At least, not in the way others were. "What is your name, human?" the queen asked, her tone slightly softer now. "Jack," he replied simply. "Well, Jack," the queen said, stepping forward slightly, her regal posture still commanding respect. "You may have gotten this far, but do you truly believe you can help me escape this place alive? The guards will soon notice the force field is down, and they will come." Jack met her gaze, his confidence unwavering. "I have a plan," he said. "I've already caused a distraction outside with some of the local predators. That should keep the guards busy for a while. If we move fast, we can use the hidden paths through the jungle to get far enough away before they realize what's happened." The queen raised an eyebrow. "And what about their ships?" They will pursue us. This planet is not large enough to hide from their scanners for long." Jack smiled. "There's a storm coming," he said, pointing to the darkening sky through a small window in the cell. "A big one. Their scanners won't work in it, and their ships won't be able to fly. We can use the cover of the storm to escape." The Queen looked at Jack with a mixture of surprise and admiration. This human, who seemed so simple at first glance, had thought of everything. His plan wasn't grand or heroic, but it was clever, practical, and it just might work. "You are more resourceful than I expected," the Queen admitted, her voice filled with something close to respect. "Very well, human. Let us see if your plan is as good as you believe." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The hardest part was convincing her to trust him. Now, they just had to execute the plan. As they began to move through the fortress, Jack led the way, keeping a careful eye on the surroundings. The sounds of growling creatures and shouts from the guards echoed in the distance, but so far, no one seemed to notice the Queen's cell had been breached. The Queen followed closely behind him, her tall, regal figure moving with surprising grace despite the danger around them. Jack couldn't help but be impressed. Even in this dire situation, she held herself like a ruler, every step filled with confidence and strength. As they reached the outer perimeter of the fortress, Jack stopped, holding up a hand to signal for the Queen to pause. He scanned the area, his eyes sharp, looking for any signs of danger. The guards were still distracted, dealing with the chaos caused by the jungle creatures. "This way," Jack whispered, motioning toward a narrow path hidden by thick vines. "It'll take us deep into the jungle, away from their ships." The Queen nodded, her sharp eyes following his every move. "Lead the way, human." And with that, the unlikely pair, the powerful alien Queen and the simple human, slipped into the shadows of the jungle, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The Queen, once skeptical of Jack's abilities, was now starting to see that this human might just be the key to her survival. The escape plan begins. Jack and the alien Queen moved swiftly through the dense jungle, their steps careful but quick. The heavy, humid air clung to them, and the distant sound of growling creatures still echoed from behind. The chaos Jack had unleashed at the fortress worked perfectly. The alien guards were too busy fighting off the jungle beasts to notice the Queen's escape, at least for now. "This way," Jack whispered, pushing aside thick vines that blocked their path. The jungle was dark, the thick canopy of trees above them barely letting in any light. But Jack knew this area well. He had spent months surviving here, mapping every hidden trail and avoiding the deadly creatures that roamed the shadows. It was this knowledge that gave him a fighting chance to help the Queen escape. The Queen followed him silently, her eyes sharp, watching their surroundings closely. She wasn't used to trusting others, especially not a human. But so far, Jack had proven himself clever and resourceful. He wasn't what she had expected. This human, though simple by her empire's standards, had managed to sneak into the most heavily guarded place on the planet and free her without being caught. It was impressive. "Your plan seems to be working," the Queen finally said, her voice soft but firm. "But how far can we go before they find us?" Jack glanced over his shoulder at her. "We'll reach a safe spot soon. There's a cave system up ahead, hidden deep in the rocks. We can take shelter there until the storm hits." The Queen raised an eyebrow. "And you think the storm will be enough to hide us?" Jack nodded, moving swiftly through the thick underbrush. "I've seen storms on this planet before. They're not like anything you've seen. The wind, the lightning, it's so strong that even their ships won't be able to fly. Their scanners won't work either. We'll be invisible to them." The Queen considered his words, her expression thoughtful. She had underestimated this planet and its dangers. It was far wilder than she had imagined, and it seemed that this human knew exactly how to survive in such a place. But even so, she knew that they were not safe yet. The alien soldiers wouldn't give up easily. They would search every inch of the planet to find her. "We need to move faster," the Queen said, her voice filled with urgency. "It won't be long before they realize I'm gone." Jack agreed, picking up the pace. His boots crunched softly against the damp jungle floor as they weaved through thick trees and giant plants. The sounds of the jungle surrounded them, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of strange creatures. But Jack remained focused. They had to reach the cave before the guards discovered their escape. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the sky above darkened. Thick clouds began to gather, swirling ominously as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming, just as Jack had predicted. Lightning flashed in the distance, lighting up the sky for a brief moment, followed by the low rumble of thunder. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice barely audible over the growing roar of the storm. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the entrance to the cave system. It was hidden behind a massive waterfall, the rushing water masking the entrance from anyone who didn't know where to look. Jack led the Queen carefully around the edge of the waterfall, his feet slipping slightly on the wet rocks. They slipped through the narrow opening, the sound of the waterfall drowning out all other noise as they entered the cool, dark cave. Inside, it was quiet. The cave was spacious, with smooth stone walls that curved around them. Jack had discovered this place early on during his time on the planet. It had become his refuge, a place where he could rest and plan without fear of being found. "We should be safe here for a while," Jack said, glancing around the cave. "The storm will hit soon, and they won't be able to track us once it does." The Queen stepped forward, inspecting their surroundings. Her glowing eyes scanned the cave's walls, and for the first time, she seemed to relax. Just a little. She had never imagined that she would be hiding in a place like this, relying on a human to protect her. But here she was, and she couldn't deny that Jack had proven himself capable. "You have done well, human," the Queen said, turning to face him. "But this is only a temporary solution. We cannot stay here forever." Jack nodded, already thinking about their next steps. "I know. Once the storm passes, we'll need to find a way off this planet. I've been working on a plan for that too." The Queen tilted her head, curious. "A plan? You truly think you can escape with me, past their entire fleet?" Jack smiled faintly. "I've been gathering parts from the wreckage of old ships. It's not much, but I think I can build something that can get us off the ground. At least far enough to avoid their scanners and get to safety." The Queen stared at him, surprised once again by his resourcefulness. This human was full of surprises. She had expected him to be simple, weak, and easily crushed. But instead, he had proven to be smart, quick, and determined. Perhaps, she thought, this human was more than what he seemed. "Very well," the Queen said, her tone decisive. "We shall wait out the storm. And then we will see if your plan truly works." As the storm outside raged, the two of them sat in the quiet cave, waiting for the next phase of their escape to begin. The Queen, once proud and untouchable, now found herself trusting the human with her life. It was an unexpected partnership, but perhaps, she thought, it was the one that would save them both. The Great Rescue. The storm raged outside, fierce winds howling through the jungle. Inside the cave, Jack and the Queen sat in silence, both deep in thought. The Queen's glowing eyes watched as Jack inspected the small pile of parts he had gathered from old ships. The plan was dangerous, but it was their only chance. Jack knew that if they stayed hidden for too long, the alien soldiers would eventually find them. The storm wouldn't last forever, and once it cleared, the search would begin again. They needed to act fast. His heart raced with the pressure of what was to come, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had survived worse before, and now the Queen's life depended on him. "Are you sure this will work?" the Queen asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. She stood tall, her regal presence unshaken despite the danger they faced. Jack looked up from the parts, his face serious but determined. "It has to. Once the storm clears, we'll use this makeshift ship to escape. I've rigged it to take off just long enough to get us past their scanners. After that, we can make a jump to one of their abandoned outposts." The Queen frowned, clearly skeptical. "And what makes you so sure you can pilot this contraption?" Jack grinned, trying to ease her worries. "I've flown worse things. Besides, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to work for a little while." The Queen studied him for a moment, then nodded. She had no other choice but to trust him now. Despite her doubts, she had seen how resourceful Jack was. If anyone could pull off a miracle like this, it was him. "We need to move once the storm slows down," Jack continued. "The ship isn't far, but we'll have to cross a lot of open ground to get to it. They'll be watching, so we need to be fast." The Queen tightened her grip on the weapon Jack had given her earlier. It wasn't as advanced as the ones her people used, but it was still powerful enough to defend herself if needed. She didn't like the idea of running, but she knew it was the only way to escape. As the storm began to calm, Jack stood up, stretching his sore muscles. "It's time," he said quietly. "We need to move now, before they start scanning the area again." The Queen followed him to the cave entrance, the sound of the storm still echoing in the distance. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the winds had weakened, but the sky was still dark and ominous. They had to act fast. Jack led the way through the jungle, moving quickly but cautiously. The Queen followed closely, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. They were getting closer to the hidden ship, but Jack knew the real challenge would come once they reached it. As they approached the clearing where the ship was hidden, Jack motioned for the Queen to stop. He crouched low, carefully surveying the area. There were no signs of the alien soldiers yet, but he knew they were close. The ship was buried under thick vines and leaves, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. "There it is," Jack whispered, pointing to the pile of debris that hid the ship. "We just need to get inside and power it up." The Queen nodded, but before they could move, a loud roar echoed through the jungle. Jack's heart sank. The alien soldiers had found them. "Run," Jack shouted, grabbing the Queen's arm and pulling her toward the hidden ship. They sprinted across the open ground, the sound of alien war cries growing louder behind them. They reached the ship just as the first shots rang out. Jack quickly tore away the vines and leaves, revealing the small, battered vessel underneath. It wasn't much to look at, old, rusty, and barely holding together. But it was their only hope. "Get inside," Jack yelled as he worked to open the hatch. The Queen didn't hesitate, climbing into the cramped cockpit as Jack followed close behind. He scrambled to the controls, his hands moving quickly as he tried to power up the ship. The engines sputtered and groaned, but after a few tense moments, they roared to life. Jack let out a relieved breath. But they weren't safe yet. The alien soldiers had reached the clearing, their weapons trained on the ship. Jack could see them through the cockpit window, their faces twisted with anger as they realized what was happening. "Hold on," Jack shouted as he pushed the controls forward. The ship lurched violently, the engines straining as it lifted off the ground. Shots rang out, hitting the ship's hull and causing sparks to fly. Jack grit his teeth, pushing the ship higher into the air. They just needed to get high enough to escape the enemy's line of sight. The Queen held on tightly, her heart racing as the ship shook and rattled. She had never experienced anything like this before, flying in such a primitive machine, in the hands of a human. But somehow, against all odds, they were rising above the jungle, leaving the soldiers behind. "We're almost clear," Jack shouted over the noise of the engines. The ship shot through the last layer of clouds, and the alien soldiers below grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than dots on the ground. As the sky opened up before them, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had made it. They were free. The Queen looked at Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and amazement. This simple human, with his rusty ship and wild plan, had done what no one else could. He had rescued her from the clutches of her enemies and given her a chance at freedom. The alien king's shock, Back on the alien homeworld, the Grand Palace was filled with tension. The alien king, tall and mighty, stood on the balcony of his throne room, gazing out at the distant stars. His deep purple eyes burned with frustration. His queen had been missing for days now, captured by his enemies. The search parties he had sent had all failed. It was unthinkable. No one had dared challenge the king's rule like this before. Suddenly, one of his generals, an alien with sharp features and bright green skin, burst into the room. His breathing was heavy, and his expression was frantic. The king turned slowly, his gaze piercing. "What is it?" the king demanded, his voice booming through the chamber. "My lord," the general said, bowing low, his voice shaking with fear and uncertainty. We've located the queen." The king's eyes widened for a moment before narrowing into slits. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. He had been waiting for this news, but something about the general's fear troubled him. She is on her way here, my lord," the general stammered. "But there is something you need to know." The king's patience was thin. "Speak," he commanded. "The queen, she was rescued," the general said slowly, "by a human." The room fell silent. For a long moment, the king simply stared at the general as if he hadn't heard the words correctly. "A human." The king finally said, his voice low and dangerous, "You are telling me that one of those primitive creatures from that backward planet rescued my queen?" The general swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yes, my lord. The human somehow managed to evade our forces. He escaped with her in a stolen ship." The king's fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. How could this be possible? Humans were weak, unremarkable beings compared to the advanced alien species that ruled the galaxy. The idea that one of them had not only survived, but had outsmarted his own elite forces was beyond belief. "Where are they now?" the king asked, his voice tight with anger. "They are approaching the planet as we speak," the general replied, his head still bowed. "The queen has sent word that she is unharmed, and she insists that the human not be harmed when they land." The king's eyes flared with rage. "She insists," he repeated, his voice rising. "The queen insists that I show mercy to the creature who dared touch her, who dared interfere in matters of my kingdom." The general said nothing, too terrified to respond. The king turned away, his mind boiling with a mixture of fury and confusion. His queen had always been strong and proud. She had never needed anyone's help, least of all from a lowly human. And yet here she was, returning to him with this strange, weak creature by her side. As he paced the room, his thoughts darkened. What had happened while she was in captivity? Had this human bewitched her somehow? The king could not allow this insult to go unpunished, but he also knew he needed answers. If the queen herself was defending the human, there had to be a reason. Moments later, the palace guards announced that the queen's ship had landed. The king, still seething with anger, straightened his royal robes and walked to the throne room, where he would face his returning queen and the human who had dared interfere. The massive doors to the throne room swung open, and there stood the queen, her regal figure as commanding as ever. But beside her was a sight the king never thought he would see. An earthling, standing tall and calm, with eyes that showed no fear, even in the presence of the king. The king's eyes locked onto the human. Jack stood next to the queen, his clothes torn and dirty from the days of running and fighting. Despite his appearance, there was a strange confidence in his stance that made the king's blood boil even more. The queen stepped forward, her eyes meeting her king's. "I have returned," she said firmly, her voice steady, "and I owe my life to this human. If not for his bravery, I would still be in the hands of our enemies." The king barely listened to her words, his gaze fixed on Jack. "This is the human you speak of," he growled. "This primitive thing." The queen's eyes narrowed. "He may be human, but he is no primitive. He outsmarted your soldiers. He risked his life to save mine. You should show him respect." The king's fury was barely contained. Respect. For a human. They are nothing compared to us. I will not allow one of their kind to walk freely in my kingdom, no matter what he has done. Jack, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. I didn't come here for your respect, he said, his voice calm but firm. I came to get the queen to safety. Now that she's here, I'll leave if that's what you want. The king glared at him, taking a step forward. You think you can just walk away? You have interfered with my kingdom, insulted my honor. The queen stepped between them, her eyes blazing. He saved me, she said, her voice hard. You will not harm him. For a moment, the tension in the room was so thick it felt like it might snap. The king's rage boiled just beneath the surface, but the queen's unwavering stance held him in place. He could not defy her in front of his people, not without risking a deeper rift. Finally, the king let out a slow breath, turning away. Take the human to the holding chambers, he ordered, his voice cold. I will decide what to do with him later. Jack met the queen's eyes for a brief moment as the guards approached him, and she gave him a small, reassuring nod. Whatever happened next, they had both survived the impossible together.